I remember laughing at the sign when I saw it. Not losing my mind giggling or anything, just a quick through-the-nose laugh, mostly just because of how weird it was. It looked like a Halloween decoration someone had forgotten to take down, which would have been a convincing explanation considering it was early November. The placement did strike me, though, since it was staked into the ditch beside the 11 with nothing but frosted fields on either side. It was just one word, crudely painted in black on a section of pressboard. Loup-garou. I thought about how stupid it was that I could remember the word for werewolf in French, but not how to ask for a bill. I didn't think about it for long, though. As weird as it was, reaching the final third of my 7-hour drive had cut my attention span pretty short. Luckily for me, there were plenty much more beautiful and poignant sights to keep me occupied as I rode through the shield. Pretty soon I got caught up in admiring the sheets of rock that rose and fell on either side of the road, and running through what little high school French I could conjure up in the back of my mind. That trip was the farthest north I had ever driven by myself, and under any other circumstances I wouldn't have agreed to it. A drive like that was maddening to take alone, at least for me. I'm what my sister called a puppy dog extrovert, meaning that I would practically wait by the door for people to return when I was left alone. I could take care of myself just fine. It was just that I didn't like being on my own. It made me uneasy. I took after my mom in that regard. Growing up, she had a history with our neighbors for showing up without notice for a chat because there was no one at home at her place. It had been a bit of a surprise when her and my dad had announced they were retiring somewhere as remote as North Bay, but if there was one thing my mom loved more than people, it was wildlife. To their credit, it seemed to be one of the best ideas they ever had, as they both seemed to be having the time of their lives up there. My dad had even switched from painting exclusively portraits of stern and stoic older men to nearly Bob Ross-esque landscapes. All in all, it seemed like a good decision. Of course, then I hadn't taken into account the possibility that I might have to make the drive from Windsor to North Bay without enough time to find someone to go with me. When my dad had called me that morning to tell me about the crash, he was insistent that they were both fine, but said that my mom had broken a few bones and had to stay in the hospital for a while until she had recovered a bit more. Despite my dad's usual calm composure, I was worried. They were both getting up in years, so a broken bone was nothing to wave off. I told him I would come right away, which, with my husband in Detroit for a conference and my sister in Milan on her honeymoon, meant I was going alone. Thinking about the reason for the trip made me drive a bit more consciously. I turned up the radio to try and fill the sudden void in my car. The station I had been listening to was starting to fade in and out as I drove out of its range, so I began looking for a new one. When I found a clear one, the host was in the middle of a weather report for the Muskoka area. I think his exact words were, "An all-night, all-nasty, freezing rainstorm." He advised folks to stay home with a good book and warned drivers to stay off the roads if they could. One benefit of an empty car was that I could swear as loudly as I wanted. It was already 6:45 and the sun would be going down soon. I wasn't far from North Bay, but the roads already had me driving slower than I would have liked, and over an hour in an ice storm in the dark would likely get me to the hospital in much worse condition than my parents. I wasn't keen on trying to find a place to stop for the night, but as I came up near Algonquin, the wind was picking up, and the sparse gray clouds in the distance were condensing into the kind of churning wall of navy blue that made me feel a bit claustrophobic. I continued as far as I dared down the 11 before asking Siri to find me a motel. I pulled off the 11 onto the 3 and into Huntsville just as a trickle of freezing rain began to drum on the roof of my car. I got the cheapest place Siri could find, a single room at an Econo Lodge, and checked in for the night. The clerk seemed surprised when I walked in and was a little short with me, but I didn't blame them. I'm sure working at a motel in this area in the winter was a pretty tedious and thankless job. I made sure to thank them as they handed me my room key. I also thanked my past self for having the foresight to pack a few days' worth of clothes and toiletries into my husband's smaller suitcase to bring with me before calling into work and running out the door earlier that day. When I got to my room, I called my dad to tell him where I was and that I wouldn't be able to get there until tomorrow morning. He told me to take my time, stressed that there was no rush. I asked to talk to my mom, but he said that she was still on a lot of painkillers and letting her sleep for now was best. We talked for a while about some of the more monumental storms he and my mom had experienced since they moved up north, and reminisced for a while about the forts me and my sister would build in snow hills after big storms when I was a kid. I think he could tell that I was trying to distract myself from the fact that I had just checked into a motel on my own for the first time. He humored me for as long as he could, but he was still recovering from minor injuries himself and needed rest. So I told him to pass on my well wishes to my mom, and we said goodnight. By the time I got off the phone with my dad, it was almost 9. I quickly turned on the TV to fill the silence, and spent a while idly flipping through channels before my stomach loudly reminded me that I hadn't stopped anywhere to eat on the drive. I'd seen a few fast food places in the plaza across the street that now seemed more enticing than ever. I parted the curtains and looked out my window to see that the storm hadn't picked up from the light drizzle it had been when I had gotten in. Aside from the clouds blocking out all the stars, it honestly didn't look that bad outside, and I kicked myself a bit when I realized I practically could have reached North Bay by now if I hadn't stopped. Still, I told myself it was better safe than sorry. My stomach decided to throw my jacket over my head and speed walk over to the Popeyes across the street. I hadn't expected it to be busy, but I also hadn't expected it to be completely empty. It was a little ominous walking into absolutely no one there. Of course, there was someone there. An employee emerged from the back shortly after I walked in to take my order, but that moment of extra solitude made me realize that I hadn't seen another person aside from the motel clerk since the exit into Huntsville. I must have seen other cars or pedestrians and just not noticed them, I told myself, but I couldn't remember a single one. Even then, looking out the window as I waited for my food, I didn't see anyone walking or driving or occupying the windows of any surrounding businesses. I rationalized that everyone was just inside taking shelter from the coming storm, and tried not to think about it too much. I struck up a light conversation with the employee as she got my order together, mentioning the silly way the radio host had referred to the storm. She was friendly and just as talkative as I was. She happily told me about the most recent scandal that radio host had been involved in, which led to some gossip about celebrity scandals. We chatted for a while, not really anything of great value, but she seemed to enjoy the company as much as I did, as she seemed to be the only one on shift there. That conversation almost put me entirely at ease until, as she handed me my takeout bag, I said that it seemed strange that everyone had battened down their hatches so early when the storm wasn't even that bad, making some joke about thinking that northerners usually toughed out storms. When I said that, her friendly smile almost completely disappeared. She was still polite, giving me some short response about safety, but she seemed distressed when I mentioned the storm not being that bad. She seemed almost sad. When I thanked her for my food and wished her a good rest of her evening, I could feel her gaze following me as I walked out, heavy with that sudden sadness. That definitely rattled me, and not wanting to be out in the empty street for any longer than I had to, I hurried back towards the motel. I still looked both ways as I crossed the street, though I knew in the pit of my stomach that there would be no need. I was so freaked out at that point that I almost cheered out loud when I saw a new truck in the parking lot next to mine, and almost didn't notice that the person standing next to it was looking into my car. When I did notice, I slowed my approach. I'm a people person, but I'm not completely reckless. When I called out a hello and asked if I could help the person with something, I expected a startled excuse or an apology or even for them to just book it. Instead, this person just casually straightened up, moving their hands from the driver's side window of my car to their pockets and turning towards me with no display of alarm or concern. I saw then that they appeared to be a man, tall and a bit on the heavier side, but fit-looking. What struck me most about him was his very well-kept beard, and that he was only wearing jeans and a flannel despite the cold wind and sprinkle of icy rain. "Is this your car?" he asked matter-of-factly, almost sounding bored. He spoke with an accent, but one too subtle for me to place at first. I stayed about 10 feet away and told him that it was. I didn't want to assume anything in any direction, but I prepared myself both to offer him my dinner or to run into the motel if I had to, keeping a clear path to the front door. He made no move towards or away from me. He just leaned back against the truck next to my car and spoke as if we were colleagues on a business lunch. "You'll have to excuse me," he said. "I was just looking to see if you had anything flammable." I don't know why that statement didn't set off any alarm bells, or why, in the moment, I convinced myself that what he had meant was that he was looking for a light. I reached into my jacket and produced my Zippo, offering it to him. When I held it out, he did the last thing I would have expected. He started laughing, giggling as he waved it away, saying something I couldn't quite hear, but that sounded like it might have been too pity. It was the laughing that finally spiked my concern, and when I put my lighter back in my pocket, I discreetly switched it for my phone. I thought about just going inside, but I didn't want him to try and break into my car. I thought about asking him to leave, but he really hadn't done anything, and as far as I knew, was just a weirdly curious guy standing next to what could be assumed to be his own truck. Indecision kept me rooted in place, watching him carefully. He didn't seem to care much about my caution, but did seem interested in me. "Traveling?" he asked nonchalantly, cocking his head to the side. I told him yes. I'm not entirely sure why I answered, but any conversation kept that itching loneliness at bay, even that one. I told him I was on my way to visit family, remaining fairly vague, but he didn't press about my destination any further. He simply nodded. "Family is a good reason to travel," he said. "Always traveling on business becomes so tedious." He put a strange emphasis on the word business, and I wasn't sure if it was because of his accent or because of something else. A part of me wanted to ask what line of business he was in, but a chill cut through my jacket and I started to think up the best way to excuse myself when he continued. "You shouldn't be out here." It didn't sound like a threat, just another moderately detached, matter-of-fact statement. I took it to mean out in the cold, and began to say something about heading inside when he laughed again, an amused giggle. When he spoke again, I recognized the words. "La chasse commence." The hunt begins. That was the tipping point. I eyed my path to the motel door, willing my legs to take me there, but before I could so much as flinch, the man once again straightened up, this time casually turning away from me, rounding the front of the truck and getting in the driver's seat. As he did, I moved in a semicircle, keeping my car between me and his truck just in case he decided to try and run me down or something, but he just quietly pulled out of his spot and left the parking lot. I was beyond bewildered as I watched his truck disappear down the empty street, but not before I caught a glimpse of what was in the back of his truck. It was covered by a large blue tarp, and when he was parked, my mind had completely glossed over it. But now, as he drove under the bright pool of a streetlight, I saw the distinct shadow of a large, barred cage. I didn't care about the storm anymore. I wanted to get out of this weird dead town as fast as possible, no matter what the roads were like. I wasn't surprised to find the lobby of the motel empty when I walked in. I almost laughed at the empty front desk, but the sound of the man's giggling still echoed in my mind and kept me quiet. I focused on remembering which room was mine. As I made my way back to it, the entire motel was dead quiet. I wondered if there was even anyone else checked in. Luckily, my room was on the first floor, not too far from the lobby. I got in and grabbed my things as quickly as I could and headed back out into the lobby, determined to just start driving north and find some rest stop to wait at until morning. At this point, sleeping was not part of the equation. I stayed alert for any movement or sound as I packed my car and got into the driver's seat, but still there were no signs of life. As I started the engine, I jumped when my radio began to sing. I left it on, not wanting to have to face the suffocating silence again. As I retraced my way back to the highway, seeing cars and driveways and houses and buildings with lights on but no people, that radio host came on again, giving a sign-off for the day. One line in particular stood out like blood on snow. "The storm is really picking up out there, folks, so keep those doors locked tight," he said. Even in my mild panic, I was fully aware that the sprinkle of freezing rain had stopped completely. I changed the station and headed towards the on-ramp. I tried to think of anything else to distract me as I drove. How nice the trees were, sparkling with a very light layer of sleet. What a nice color that employee from Popeye's hair had been. How I had always wanted a nice strong red like that, how my coworkers would react if I showed up to work one day as a redhead, how good Popeye's biscuits were, how my husband always made fun of me for making a little sandwich by loading up the biscuit with mashed potatoes and popcorn chicken, how hungry I was. Oh, where had I put my takeout bag? Did I drop it without realizing? I glanced backwards into the back seat where I had thrown my suitcase for a fraction of a second, and the next thing I knew, I had hit something. On instinct, I slammed on the brakes. Luckily, the road wasn't too slippery for my tires to grab and pull me to an abrupt stop. I think I shouted in surprise, but I'm not entirely sure. For a moment, I just sat there, gripped tight on the steering wheel, wide-eyed gaze forward and trying to catch my breath. The impact hadn't been enough to activate the airbags, but it had knocked the wind out of me and made a noticeable dent in the hood. As I stared out the windshield, I noticed it had also knocked out one of the headlights. In the illumination of my one remaining headlight, I saw a crumpled figure about 15 feet from my car, the streak of dark blood on the road like an arrow pointing right at me. I repeated a string of, "Oh God, oh God, oh God," under my breath as I unbuckled and popped the door. Even though I was stopped in the middle of the road, I didn't bother to look for oncoming traffic. There wasn't another car in sight, and deep down I knew there wouldn't be any coming. When I stepped out and looked at the crumpled form, it wasn't moving. I could barely breathe. Stretched out on the pavement across the streak of blood was a pale, bloodied hand. I had hit a person. I called out to them, unsure of what else to do. I got no response. I began to walk over to them, babbling, asking if they were okay, trying not to hyperventilate when they moved. It was small, just a quick jerk of the limbs as they lay in an uncomfortable fetal position. This should have been encouraging, but it made me freeze. Again came a quick jerking movement. Something didn't seem right. My rational brain began to kick in then, telling me to go back to the car and grab my phone to call an ambulance. But still, I stayed frozen, watching the figure twitch. As they twitched, there was a shrill, ringing whine, like a dog that had been kicked. Then, all of a sudden, their limbs spasmed, palms and soles finding the pavement, and with a strength that couldn't have been possible, they pushed themselves up off the ground. They were clearly injured, blood pouring from their left forearm, which seemed to respond with a bit of a delay, likely broken. Their legs and torso were very badly scraped, and their raw skin was embedded with tiny rocks and chunks of pavement. But as they rose and shook their body, sending a spray of blood out around them, they barely seemed to notice their injuries. They were very tall and completely naked, with short hair that looked freshly cut but was in disarray, caked with blood and dirt. Aside from their head, they were completely hairless. At first glance, they looked trim and fit, but the longer you looked at them, the more apparent it became that something was slightly wrong with their proportions. Limbs a bit too long, curves and edges too smooth, almost like a Barbie doll. I stared, unable to move, unable to think. I just watched as this person-shaped thing checked over its body with no obvious distress, face a mask of neutrality. Then it looked right at me, and when it did, its eyes shone in the glow of my headlight. It flashed me a smile, if baring one's teeth with a clumsy curl of the lips can be called a smile. And then it spoke. I will never forget the sound of its voice. The cadence was measured and deliberate, and for all intents and purposes normal, but the voice that spoke each calculated syllable was harsh and throaty, wavering from a high-pitched youthful exclamation to a much deeper cough-like rumble. The entire thing was unbelievable, but for some reason, what disturbed me most of all about the situation then was that such a horrible, inhuman noise was coming from such a perfect, flawless face. Hello? Noise having. As I stared in blank shock, it turned and half ran, half limped into the darkness away from my car. I didn't call an ambulance, or the police, or anyone. When that thing disappeared into the dark trees beyond the ditch, I just got back into my car and kept driving. I drove without stopping, and I reached North Bay before midnight that night. When my dad saw my car in the morning and asked me what had happened, I told him that I had accidentally clipped a signpost in the parking lot. If he saw the specks of blood across the hood, he didn't point them out. I stayed with my parents for a few days in North Bay until my mom was released from the hospital. When I finally left, I made sure to leave early in the morning and get the drive done in broad daylight, and I didn't make any stops. Now, whenever I visit my parents, I take a flight up from Toronto.